World War I, the war that changed everything. It began with a gunshot and ended with empires in ruins. The year was 1914. The world was a powder keg, one spark, and it exploded. For decades, Europe had been drifting toward disaster. Powerful nations had built massive armies, drawn red lines on maps, and signed secret pacts behind closed doors. Pride and paranoia were rising like steam from a boiling pot. No one knew when it would boil over, only that it would. At the center of it all was a tangled web of alliances. Britain, France, and Russia on one side, the Triple Entente. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy on the other, the Triple Alliance. Like dominoes stacked in a circle, each nation had promised to defend the next. If one fell, they all would. But beneath the diplomacy, old empires were rotting. Austria-Hungary ruled over dozens of ethnic groups desperate for independence. The Ottoman Empire, once mighty, was now called the sick man of Europe. Russia was seething with unrest, and Germany, it was young, industrialized, and hungry for power. In the shadows, nationalism festered, revolution whispered, and in the Balkans, the fuse was already lit. Then came Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting Bosnia, a region teeming with Slavic resentment. A Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip waited in the crowd. He was just 19 years old. As the Archduke's car passed by, Princip pulled a pistol and fired 2 shots. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were dead within minutes. Austria-Hungary was furious. It blamed Serbia, demanding justice. Serbia offered cooperation, but not submission. Vienna wanted war, but it needed backup. So Austria turned to Germany. Germany issued a blank check, pledging unconditional support. Confident and reckless, Austria declared war on Serbia on July 28th. Within days, the alliances activated like machinery. Russia, bound to defend Serbia, began mobilizing. Germany declared war on Russia, France prepared for battle, and then came the fatal move. Germany invaded Belgium to strike France from the north, a violation of Belgian neutrality. That's when Britain entered the war. The world cracked open. What should have been a regional conflict spiraled into global catastrophe. Within a month, Europe was ablaze. Millions of soldiers were on the move. Trains carried them to the front. Propaganda filled newspapers. Boys lied about their age to join the fight. They said it would be over by Christmas. They were wrong. The Western Front, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, became a graveyard of hopes. German troops surged into France, nearly reaching Paris. But at the Marne River, they were pushed back. The war froze, so they dug in, literally, trenches, hundreds of miles of them, muddy, blood-soaked corridors that became home to rats, lice, and death. Between them was no man's land, a hellscape of barbed wire, cratered earth, and rotting corpses. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russia clashed with Germany and Austria. It was more mobile, but just as brutal. At Tannenberg, the Germans crushed a massive Russian army, but Russia had numbers, and those numbers kept coming. Then far from Europe, the war spread like wildfire. Japan joined the Allies. The Ottoman Empire sided with Germany. Battles erupted in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. This wasn't just a European war, it was the First World War. New weapons changed everything. Machine guns mowed down charging soldiers. Artillery turned landscapes into moonscapes. Poison gas crept silently through the trenches. Airplanes buzzed overhead. Submarines prowled the seas. The old rules of war were dead. This was mechanized slaughter. And as the world descended into chaos, leaders promised victory. But what they delivered was death. By 1915, it was clear. This wasn't a war of swift victories. It was a war of exhaustion, a war of attrition. On the Western Front, soldiers fought not for ground, but for inches. Every advance was paid in blood. The Battle of Verdun began in February 1916. The German goal was simple: bleed France dry. It lasted 10 months. Over 700,000 men were killed or wounded, for little more than a few miles of land. France held the line, but barely. Then came the Somme. July 1st, 1916. The British unleashed the largest artillery barrage in history. They expected to walk through shattered German lines, but the defenses held. On the first day alone, the British suffered 57,000 casualties, the bloodiest day in their military history. Over 1 million men would die before the Somme ended, and the front line barely moved. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia was crumbling. The Brusilov offensive of 1916 stunned the Central Powers, but the Russian army was stretched thin, poorly equipped, and suffering massive losses. Back home, revolution was brewing. In the south, Italy, who had switched sides to join the Allies, launched disastrous offensives against Austria-Hungary in the Alps. The terrain was hell: frozen trenches, avalanches, mountaintop slaughter. Little was gained. In the Middle East, Arab rebels, guided by British officers like T.E. Lawrence, rose against the Ottoman Empire. Cities like Damascus and Baghdad would fall. The empire was rotting from within, and at sea a silent killer emerged: the German U-boat. Submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking Allied ships without warning. In 1915, one torpedo struck a civilian ocean liner, the Lusitania. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. Outrage followed. The United States stayed neutral, but only for now. Back in Europe, soldiers lived in filth. Trench foot, shell shock, and disease became as deadly as bullets. Letters home spoke of nightmares. Men who went in cheerful came out broken. This wasn't glory. This was hell, and it wasn't over yet. By 1917, the world was bleeding out. Millions were dead, entire generations lost, and still, no end in sight. But the foundations were cracking. In Russia, years of war, hunger, and chaos finally boiled over. The Tsar was overthrown in a revolution. A provisional government tried to hold the country together, but failed. Then came the Bolsheviks. Led by Lenin, they seized power in October, promising peace, land, and bread. Russia withdrew from the war in early 1918 through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, surrendering huge territories to Germany. For the Central Powers, it seemed like a breakthrough. But a new storm was rising from across the Atlantic. After years of neutrality, the United States had had enough. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare had sunk American ships. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret offer from Germany to Mexico. Join us and you can reclaim lost U.S. territory. The message was intercepted. Americans were outraged. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Fresh troops, endless supplies, a powerful new force entered the battlefield. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, Germany saw a closing window. With Russia gone, it transferred troops west. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched a final, desperate offensive, the Kaiserschlacht. They pushed deep into Allied lines, closer to Paris than they'd been in years. But they had overreached. By summer, the tide turned. The Allies, reinforced by over 1 million American soldiers, struck back. The 100 Days Offensive began. German troops, exhausted, starving, and demoralized, couldn't hold the line. One by one, their allies collapsed. Bulgaria surrendered. The Ottoman Empire signed an armistice. Austria-Hungary fractured from within, its empire falling apart as different ethnic groups declared independence. Inside Germany, revolution erupted. Sailors mutinied. Workers went on strike. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. Armistice. The war was over, but the world it left behind would never be the same. More than 16 million people were dead. Another 20 million wounded. Cities were in ruins. Economies shattered. Borders redrawn. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, formally ended the war. But it didn't bring peace. It punished Germany harshly: territorial losses, disarmament, and crushing reparations. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war, a humiliation that would leave deep scars. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, gone, split into new nations: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, dismantled, carved into British and French mandates. The Russian Empire, reborn as the Soviet Union. Old orders had died. New ideologies were taking root. Fascism, communism, ultranationalism. The League of Nations was formed to prevent another world war. But it was weak. The damage had been done. Millions of veterans returned home with shattered bodies and minds, some without limbs, others with wounds you couldn't see. Shell shock, trauma, silence. An entire generation, marked forever. And yet, the world tried to move on. But underneath the surface, hatred brewed. Economic collapse, resentment, revenge. The First World War didn't end war. It planted the seeds for the next one. Just 2 decades later, those seeds would bloom again in fire and fury. World War I was not just the war to end all wars. It was the war that rewrote the map and rewired the future. A brutal reminder of how fragile peace truly is. And it all began with a single bullet in Sarajevo.